Okay, Michelle,
Yes, hello.
I'm going to ask you a more specific question, and that is, how does colonialism affect the environment?
That's a great question. There's a ton of effects that we often overlook in our discussions about colonialism.
Okay.
Because when we talk about colonialism, we have to think about political colonialism and cultural colonialism.
Right.
And those are super important. This is not to say that they're
course,
not,
of
but
course.
there are really profound ecological changes that happen as a result of colonialism
Okay.
that I think, and that lots of very smart historians have argued, lead directly to political and cultural shifts, both
They
for the
enable
indigenous
that,
people, those
and
were
they-
there,
right.
and for those who are colonizing, right?
Okay.
And so, for example, when the British arrive on the East Coast in the early 1600s in the United States, they bring with them a host of things. They bring with them ideas, first of all, about how nature should be used that is very different from indigenous peoples. They bring with them diseases that the indigenous peoples have never seen. And then they bring with them animals and different kinds of plants that were
Domesticated
that
animals.
that were not native
That
to the
had
United
been
States.
domesticated for hundreds of years and thus different from wild animals.
Exactly.
They're basically the product of human culture.
That's exactly right. And they're
Okay.
owned, right? So that also brings with it a set of ideas of how you structure landscapes. So
Okay,
if you're trying
right.
to keep your cows all in one place, you're going to build fences to keep them all in one place.
Right.
Whereas if you don't believe you own the cows or the deer, as indigenous peoples, most
Which
tribes
is the
didn't believe
indigenous,
in.
the Native Americans just saw themselves as part of the environment, and the animals, they were just one more of the living things.
That's right.
On the planet, not owning these animals.
That's
like
right.
The Europeans
That's right. So they weren't
did.
trying to capture them or keep them
Right,
captive, right? So
right.
that meant that like fences and property lines and stuff like that were not in the cultural understandings or the political makeup of indigenous peoples.
Right.
And so that change when you bring over cows and the cows are starting to eat the grasses in a way that they've never been eaten before because deer roam, right? But cattle stay in one place. They eat all
just
of
intensively.
all of the,
They just
That's
remove
exactly right.
every bit of it.
That's right, and that has huge ecological consequences.
Right. I
which
mean, on the
includes
simple
erosion.
level, you're removing the plant that holds the soil down.
You got it.
Yeah. And,
Exactly.
And stopping any kind of ecological succession.
Yep, exactly.
Okay.
Yep. In addition, especially the British are very desperate for trees because they have a vast navy and they have other kinds of needs for wood.
Right.
And so when they see vast forests, rather than sort of taking what they need, they're cutting down entire swaths of the forest in order to export those trees for lumber to be used in the mother country, which at the time was England, and that has significant effects. They were also deciding to trade in beaver fur, which is basically warm and fairly waterproof, so it's perfect for wet and chilly England.
Oh, yeah.
And all of this sort of, perhaps done in a small scale, wouldn't have had huge ecological consequences, but because it was done on a vast scale within a capitalist framework of economy where people are trying to gain profit off of the natural world, it really affects
Very profound effect.
ecosystems.
Yeah.
And therefore affects then sort of the cultural responses
Right.
of indigenous peoples and the tribes all over, really all, and this story is similar in the South, it's just different trees. So it really affects everything on the East Coast.
Okay.
Sort of in the Southwest, similar things are happening, but you have the whole added thing of water, right? So the notion that you're going to try to cultivate crops that the Spanish bring and have cattle, that's going to intensify the use of the surface water in desert places like Tucson, Arizona. And that use of surface water eventually affects the surrounding ecosystems, and all kinds of things can go sort of awry. This notion that there's environmental consequences to colonialism has been coined in ecological imperialism by William Crosby, who's a really fantastic historian. And so it's just another something else, and something really important to think about when you're thinking about colonialism.
Okay, so now in the whole world context, we're talking about how the Europeans transformed the New World ecologically with their impact. But the laying the groundwork actually happened back in Europe.
Right.
By a similar process of expansion and using up resources and changing the land.
Absolutely.
It's just that when we get to the New World, it's just on a so much bigger scale.
That's right.
And it's like from the outside.
Right.
And
and you don't have, it's 1600. You don't have Google Earth, so you can't see what's over here.
Right.
So when you get to that forest in Maine, And it's as far as you can see, if you can imagine such a thing, right? So you're a British explorer or even a French explorer, and you've arrived. It's unlike anything you've ever seen in your lifetime. So you can imagine them assuming or hoping or believing that that was limitless, right? That there was an infinite sort of character to the resources in the United States, which also really drove how they thought about using.
It was all there for them for the taking.
That's right. The interesting thing that we do often also overlook, if we want to talk about sort of the reverse process, is what Europeans took back to Europe from, and they took all sorts of fun little
Besides
things.
syphilis.
I was going to say, like syphilis, they take little things, very little things
Very
that have
small
very big.
microbial
Yeah,
things.
that's right. That's right. Never underestimate the power of a
But
germ.
what did they bring back?
But so,
Like
for example, tobacco, right?
Okay,
And so that creates an entire. Now we can think about slavery as having really powerful ecological roots, right? Because it is the labor around tobacco that creates at least the market, or at least the natural resources for the slave trade. And so you can think about. We often talk about the slave trade when we think about colonialism, but not always the natural resources or the ecological drivers of that trade.
Right.
So you can sort of expand. You can start expanding from there once you have an idea about ecological imperialism.
Wow, let's get back to what we were touching on with the way the natives looked at the land versus the way the Europeans looked at the land. And I always divide it into anthropocentrism and ecocentrism.
Right.
So anthropocentrism being the more European, nature there exists to serve us humans.
Right.
Whereas ecocentrism would be like the Native Americans saying, well, actually we are part of nature.
Right, exactly.
Right.
And that they have different economic systems. So even though there was trade in many of the tribes in America, it wasn't necessarily bent on surplus, on the production of surplus and sort of sale for profit, right? There wasn't a commodified monetary exchange.
A use-based thing.
Yes, exactly.
So it ended up being more sustainable in the long run.
That's right. Right. They weren't necessarily trying to sustain. I mean, they weren't.
Right. The effect was
they weren't like, oh, we are the first environmentalists. That is
how
not what was happening.
It's how the ideology actually served the environment, whether wittingly or not.
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And so that, again, you could think about, sort of does the natural resources drive culture, or does the culture drive natural resources? And so that's a really beautiful moment in history when you can sort of think about chicken and egg and how those relationships happen, and it leads to some really interesting analysis and thinking.
Very good. Very interesting.